Hi, this is Kylie Hobbs, editor of News in Mind. We hear constantly of the breakdown of our society and social relationships. We hear social media is partly to blame. We hear our modern me culture breeds ignorance of the psychological benefits of regular human interaction and contributes to social breakdown. Generation Y usually receives a fair ear-bashing on their perceived selfishness. Political parties, churches and community groups like Apex or Lions have in recent years experienced large membership declines. Well, try telling that to the thousands of Queenslanders who turned up shovel at the ready following the state's devastating floods, many offering hours, even days of assistance to people they had never even met. Volunteering Queensland, for example, registered over 20,000 volunteers in the first 2 days following the floods. And by lunchtime on the first Saturday, after waters had begun to subside, Facebook was laden with status updates claiming volunteers were no longer needed or even being turned away due to the overwhelming response. So are things really all that bad? Or have we simply discovered a different way to care and engage? Well, joining me now to discuss this and other mental health matters is Central Queensland University Psychology Professor and Chair of the Australian Psychological Society's Disaster Reference Group, Professor Ronan, and Brisbane Psychologist Kylie Hobbs from Assist Psychological and Counselling Services. Morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Kevin, firstly to you, what do you think was behind this amazing response?
Well, I think that there were a couple of things, Daniel. One of them is, I suppose, something that we tend to see after large-scale events like floods or recently in New Zealand there was the larger earthquake in Christchurch in September, and we hear regularly about various things that happen around the globe. The research kind of shows that there's a tendency for people to, when the chips are down for others, to want to come and help, and I think there's probably a variety of reasons for that. I think a second reason, really, that I've seen, we've been here in Australia now for going on 6 years, and prior to that we're in New Zealand for just about 10. And and becoming an Australian citizen last year, I guess that one of the things that my wife and I discussed and is really the issue of Australians in particular really kind of stepping up to the plate. So when you mention the number of volunteers that signed up at the volunteers.org website, I would just supplement that out here in the region, out here in Rockhampton, where people really did come out of the woodwork to assist. So on one weekend I was at the council with a bunch of other people putting together cleaning kits. The following weekend, then there was hundreds of people that came in for the call to plant things by the riverside, clean parks, clean playing fields, etc. So I guess that there's kind of universal reasons that the research shows that around what are called emergent groups or people just putting their hand up to help. But I think in particular the spirit of volunteerism and helping people when they are down is really particularly Australian.
And Kylie, I wanted to also bring you in here and try and, if I may, get your observations regarding this heartwarming voluntary response. Kevin just mentioned there, he's based in Rockhampton, so he was in the middle of some fairly substantial flooding in central Queensland. You're based in Brisbane and in private practice. What have you seen through your patients in private practice here in Brisbane?
Well, I guess I just want to agree with Kevin that it very much is that people's desire to want to help, and when confronted with the traumatic images that were shown on our TV every day, everyone felt this call to arms to want to at least help out in any way they can, and it was wonderful to see. And I believe it helps with the social psycho recovery of not only the victims but of community in general. When they have that empowerment to actually help others in need, it's beneficial for them as well as the general community and the victims themselves.
So on the the concept of volunteering and community work, in Australia at least there have been, as I mentioned in my intro, some pretty significant reductions in the number of people that are a part of faith communities and political parties, etc. Is this altruism, is this volunteering Is it on the decline and we're just waiting for something substantial to happen before we step up and help out? Or is this just a different way for us to go about assisting others? Kevin, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think that's quite a good question. And I guess the first thought that I have being here in the ivory tower, Daniel, is, that's kind of a research question around, what is there in fact a decline in a spirit of volunteerism, or is the focus changed? And I guess if I had to give my kind of little personal opinion on it, based on what I do know, I mean, I would suggest that there is a tendency for people to help others when they require assistance, and particularly in when the chips are really down. I think that when that really draws on kind of that goodwill that people do have, I think, sitting there on the periphery, and it really takes sometimes maybe a larger scale event to jolt us, I think collectively, all of us, into some attention that takes us away from our, from the quicker pace of our day-to-day lives, where oftentimes we get caught up in, we've got various things on our to-do list that span the course of a day, and the idea then of taking time out from the various, hustle and bustle of the day doesn't really, other things don't get a lot of a look in until something maybe perhaps does jolt our attention. And I think that this jolt of our attention did really bring people out of the woodwork in that spirit of volunteerism. And so my working theory is that spirit of volunteerism is lying latent, and it's lying in wait for somebody to just tap it on the shoulder a little bit, and I think this event may have done that.
Kylie, what would you say to that? Do you agree with Kevin's observation?
I certainly do. As I said before, I think it really does give us that impetus to join forces and to help out, and gives us something more substantial to do. And I'm hoping that would then correlate to people actually joining groups like Apex Alliance to continue with that volunteer and altruism spirit and continue to help with our culture.
Kevin, you're up in Rockhampton in regional Queensland. As you and I have talked about in our previous conversation, we both have an interest and a passion for rural and regional Australia. Is there any difference in the voluntary efforts and the donations and so forth in regional areas, in rural communities, compared to metropolitan metropolitan areas?
Well, I'm not sure if the spirit behind it is a whole lot different, but perhaps the focus of it might be different in terms of the needs that rural and regional people might have who have been affected versus the needs that more urban people might have had. So, I'm guessing that farmers are going to have different needs than people that are living along the river in Brisbane, for example. Yeah, I think that the focus is different. I think the spirit behind it might not be all that different, I would think at first blush.
Kevin, I had the opportunity to attend some training that you put on in Brisbane late last week that was run by the Australian Psychological Society. And I was aware through that training that you had done a lot of research in regards to natural disasters and the effect of those disasters on the community and people in general. Is there any research that you've come across, either from the Victorian bushfires or your work that you did in New Zealand, that we could learn from in regards to this?
Yeah, I guess that, I think there's quite a bit to learn, Kylie. I think that that's really quite a good question, and I guess what for our conversation now is I guess most pertinent in terms of what we can learn from the research to help those who might be listening to our chat. And I guess that in the first instance, I guess that starting from the top, the research across a variety of disasters worldwide shows us very clearly that to feel upset, stressed, distressed after an event like that, particularly if you're directly impacted, is very normal indeed. And the research further goes on to say that over time, the majority of people, if they're feeling stressed, distressed initially, tend it to come right over time. But I would also add, in following our talk about all of the voluntary activity that's going on and all the support in that area, in terms of cleaning up and the like, the research shows very clearly the more support that people have across a variety of domains, the more support that they have, the quicker, the more efficiently, the more likely they're going to be able to find their feet and feel better with time. So I guess that, certainly we're talking about the kind of support where people are pitching in a hand, but if I were to just lay out the three kinds of support from others that are really quite important, I would just kind of quickly list them as tangible support. So in a flood event like this, where there is the potential for long-term adjustment issues, particularly financially related, that tangible assistance is really quite important. So if people have had big financial losses, being able to find their feet financially in some way by getting assistance through the Commonwealth and other means is really quite important. But tangible support in a variety of ways is important. A second level of support is what we might call the information and problem-solving level of support, and that's where we go to get information about a variety of things, whether it's through a disaster recovery center, whether it's through a local council, whether it's through the group that you guys mentioned that you're quite plugged into in the more rural area down there. The third level of support is, what we might call collectively sort of the social support, recreational support, emotional support, those usual networks that we're plugged into, that I know I come from the Midwest of the U.S. originally, and I come from, both sides of my family are from farming kind of backgrounds, and I used to work in a meatworks for a while next to farmers who were, they'd plow in the morning and come in and work at night, and in knowing that kind of a lifestyle, I do know that when one is feeling, a great level of distress, I also know that being male, that we as males have a tendency to deal with stress perhaps sometimes differently than females do, and may sometimes not kind of unplug from our usual networks. And I guess that it's one of the things that I think is really quite important, is that we try to stay plugged into those usual networks that provide us with some measure of support across those three main areas. And I guess on the other side of that, it's really important for the networks that people are involved with to try to do some outreach to ensure that their members, the people that belong to those kind of collectives, are still stayed in touch with, because people who are a little bit at more risk for longer term distress are those who tend to unplug from those networks. So any way that we can try to keep them a bit more plugged in, I think, is really quite important. So I'll quit rabbiting on there.
No worries, Kevin. Well, thank you very much to both of you for your time. And Kevin, I'd love to hear from you again at some stage in the future. We'll have another chat and check in to see how things are happening around central Queensland.
And we'll look forward to it, Daniel. Thanks very much, eh?
Thanks very much.